Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Cal, so excited to have you on. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm excited as well.
So I love your work. It's had a really positive impact on me, partly coming out of a burnout episode I had 15 years ago, and I had to rediscover how to work and find a sustainable pace. Where I'd love to start is something I found really interesting in deep work, which is the whole distinction between shallow work and deep work. Can you kind of explain that? Because it resonated so deeply for me when I first heard you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple concept, but sometimes just putting vocabulary to simple concepts makes all the difference.
Right.
So that distinction, which was at the core of that book, is we can think about our efforts when we're doing knowledge work into two different categories. There's deep work, which is where you are giving something your full, unbroken attention. So it's a cognitively demanding task that you're giving your full attention and trying to do as well as you can. And then there's everything else, which I call shallow work. And I don't mean shallow to be pejorative. It's just tasks that do not require your full, unbroken, skilled attention. So like answering emails or preparing slides for a talk or something like this. And the main argument is that deep work is what really moves the needle. Whereas shallow work is important and it's what keeps the lights on, but deep work is what really produces the new value, the stuff that drives most organizations or most teams or most personal growth. So you want to make sure that both are getting attention. And we're in a time now where accidentally we are really condensing or compressing the time available for deep work. And I think that's to our detriment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you give us some examples of, like you have a lot of content creators here. So you have preachers, a lot of entrepreneurs, CEOs, management people, knowledge workers, which is really your field as well as an academic. But they're working in a white collar setting. They're working in a knowledge worker setting. So what would be an example? You gave a couple of shallow work, but like what would some deep work be? Because I agree. We talk on our team all the time in my communication company about working on it versus working in it. Like, okay, you're actually creating stuff of value rather than just replying, but just so people have those categories clear in their head.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the groups I hear from a lot is preachers. And what preachers tell me, for example, is sermon writing is deep work, yes. Right? And of course, in the religious context, we're used to this notion of the contemplative life, and only in that period of silence and contemplation can you hope to have any sort of interaction with the divine. So the preachers will say, okay, sermon writing is canonical deep, and I'm not giving it the time it needs because I have emails from parishioners, I have budget spreadsheets, I have all of the logistical overhead of having a building and a physical plant and a budget and payroll or something like this. So this was a classic example of that shallow work is important, but you need to answer emails, you need to be communicative to your parishioners, but at the same time, your sermons require unbroken concentration, and it's two different types of activities. So that was a classic example that came up a lot, actually.
Yeah. And having preached for 25, 30 years, I can tell you that's a lot of deep work. What would, for an average office worker, let's say you're a receptionist. I mean, does a receptionist have deep work, an admin assistant person? What about a middle manager? What would be an example of some deep work for someone in that situation?
Well, so I get into that exact question with those exact examples actually in the new book.
Yeah.
So I say, okay, let's be more nuanced about this, and let's talk about three different categories of workers. And I believe I use the term makers, so people who are primarily tasked with creating valuable output with their brain. So, like a computer programmer producing computer code, or a writer producing books, or a preacher producing sermons. Managers, so you're primarily managing teams that, among other things, people in your team produce value. And then, just to be needlessly alliterative, I called support staff minders. Mm-hmm. So you're mainly supporting other people with administrative or support. And I said, okay, what is the the ideal way to work in each of these situations. That is, what's the ideal way to take advantage of the way the human brain actually functions in each of these positions. And the thread that connected them all was, I would call, single focus sequentiality. Doing one thing at a time, giving it the attention it deserves until you're done with it and ready to move on to the next thing. That's actually the through line that's going to best take advantage of how the brain works. It gets the best results. So the converse to this is if you're doing many things at the same time, that while you're working, let's say as administrative assistant, you're like, well, I'm trying to solve this problem, but I'm also having to check email and I'm on Slack and I'm continually moving back and forth, like kind of working on this, kind of working on that. For a manager, you're overwhelmed with communication and trying to, I'm kind of talking to this person, sending this email, going back to my inbox, or as a maker, you're trying to write the sermon or write the computer code, but you keep interrupting yourself. In all of those cases, from a brain perspective, the ideal way to execute is actually, no, I'm just doing this one thing until I'm done, that I can clear that context and say, what's next? So I think that is a general umbrella that includes really long periods of deep work. If you're someone who's producing something very cognitively demanding, it includes that, but also includes these other types of activities as well.
As anyone who's read Digital Minimalism, which was a great book, it came out a couple of years ago, would know, you talk about the importance of undistracted work. So I want to double click on that for a moment. But I heard you say on your podcast, which I would highly recommend. I discovered it in researching this, and I'm a few episodes in and I'm like, man, this is so practical. Like if people are just looking for hacks, it's so not hacks, because your work is not about hacks, but you know what I mean? Like practical tips. How do you make this work on a Tuesday? But you said a lot of people use, I think it's called the Pomodoro technique, but basically your minimum allotment of time for undistracted work, is it 30 minutes? Is that what you're saying? Like sometimes we had trouble staying focused for 5 minutes. And I think in your new book, you say like people are checking email like 126 emails a day, and they're checking every few minutes and that kind of thing. So what is like a minimum block of like undistracted time that you think is helpful?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if we're talking about administrative tasks, if you're blocking off your day, which is what I recommend doing, I talk about this a lot on my podcast, this notion of time blocking. I think you should actually give every minute of your day a job, as opposed to just having a list and an inbox and a meeting schedule and just sort of trying to get through things. Right. So if you're going to block off your time, I think 30 minutes is the smallest block that is useful. Because once you get below 30 minutes, you're getting too precise. It's going to be too hard to try to hit that. You don't quite know how long things are going to take. So for administrative tasks, at the very minimum, I would put aside 30 minutes at a time. So if you're going to check your email, have at least 30 minutes for it. For a cognitively demanding task, I would say at least an hour. And the reason why I say at least an hour is that there is a context switching cost. So when I switch from doing this over to this demanding task, there's going to be a 10 to 15 minute period while my brain is changing what it's amplifying, what it's suppressing, and the attention networks are readjusting for this new thing I'm working on. Until that's done, I'm not at full capacity. And so if you're only working for 30 minutes on a cognitively demanding task, well, only maybe 15 minutes of that are you at full capacity. So I tend to say if it's going to be really hard on your brain, you need at least an hour, so that within that hour you can get at least 45 minutes of rock and rolling at full speed. Otherwise, it's not worth all the overhead of switching your attention.
Yeah, I remember reading an article years ago in the New York Times. You can still find it. And you hinted this in some of your books as well. But like there is a cost to context switching or to task switching. And I remember the New York Times said, any distraction. So I check my phone, right? I'm in the middle of writing an article or writing a talk that I want to deliver at a conference. I check my phone. I look at the notification. It says it's about like I think the article said there's a 25-minute reset before your brain is sort of back where it was before. What's your take on that? What are your thoughts on that, Cal?
Yeah, well, I mean, hey, and it's possible that I wrote that article.
You may have. That may have been you.
I have written about this for the Times before. To me, the context switching cost is the whole ballgame. It's the biggest misunderstood thing about knowledge work, and it's the foundation on a lot of my advice and one of the biggest issues I think we face in office work. Now, the issue is we mistake that with multitasking. So there was this period in the 90s where people were very proud about literally doing multiple things at the same time. So I'm on the phone while I'm writing, I'm answering emails while I'm at a meeting. And we figured out around the early 2000s, the research was pretty clear. This doesn't work. You can't actually write while you're listening. Your brain has to try to switch between the two, and it doesn't work very well. So as we proceeded through the 2000s, we all got very proud and said, look, we don't multitask anymore. We do one thing at a time. We don't have notifications on. We don't keep our email inbox open next to Microsoft Word while we're writing. So we think we had solved the problem. But what we weren't counting on was the context switching cost of doing quick checks. So you say, I'm single tasking because I do not have my email inbox open. Oh, well, I'm going to quickly check it, just every 6 minutes or so, but I'm not keeping it open. I'm only checking it for a minute just because I'm looking for an important email. Then I go back to what I'm doing. You think you're still single tasking, but what you don't realize is that 30-second glance at your inbox has just wrecked your ability to think for the next 15, 20, maybe 25 minutes because you have exposed your mind to these other obligations, these open loops, messages that you need to answer, but you can't answer right away, and that's lingering there. And you have just jumbled all of these attention circuits. It's not the time that you spend on the distraction that matters. It's the context shift, the cost of the switch and the switch back. And so if you look at the statistics that say, the average knowledge worker is checking an inbox once every 6 minutes. And we know it takes 10, 15, 20 minutes to get your attention back. That means the average knowledge worker is basically in a persistent state of reduced cognitive capacity. We are, by accident, making ourselves non-trivially dumber. And I think this is a huge scandalous reality about how we work today, and we're only now just starting to figure it out.
Yeah, and what's interesting for anyone who may not be familiar with your work, and I would encourage them to definitely dive in as I have over the last few years, Cal, is this is not just like you're making the argument, just to make this absolutely clear. It's not like, well, Cal, that's great, but like I don't work that way. Like I have all these powers and all that. You're like, no, neurologically, like brain chemistry research wise, you've got stuff spinning in the background now because you just looked at your phone or you just tried to answer that email or whatever. Is this like at the neurological, physiological level, we're not created to do this?
We absolutely aren't. I mean, you can study this at the neuroscience level. You can also study this at the level of psychology. The research is unequivocal about this. We are not good at quickly switching our attention. It takes time. Yeah. And if you're going back and forth, it is not a good state to put yourself in.
Yeah, you make the argument, I think, in your new book, and it's a good book. It's a big book, actually, that requires, it's going to be a reread for me. But it was that whole idea of like your system. Like if you look at most animals, if they hear something in the forest, they kind of look around and it's a survival thing. But you had this metaphor of what was it? A caveman at a computer or something like that. Or do you want to explore that a little bit? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Well, I mean, I think more generally, a lot of the ills we have with the way we work today is from these mismatches between our fundamental nature.
Right.
And the way that we have somewhat arbitrarily designed how our work actually happens. So I don't know if this is the exact analogy you're referencing, but there is a caveman analogy that's quite relevant, which is if you go back to just say early human times and say, how would you naturally coordinate, right? If there's three of you and you're on the savannah and you're hunting an antelope or something like that, the way we naturally coordinate with small groups focusing on one thing is ad hoc and on demand. It's like you go over there, I'll come over here, watch out for this. We just sort of let this thing unfold naturally. And the argument I make in the new book, the one that just came out, is that the way we work today with the advent of low friction tools, communication tools like emails, we've basically taken the way that three of us would have coordinated working on a single task like hunting an antelope, and we've scaled that up to whole organizations and dozens of different objectives. So our instincts tell us it's very natural, just ad hoc on demand, figure things out on the fly. I'll shoot you an email, you shoot me an email, maybe we're on Slack, we go even faster. Let's just figure everything out on the fly. And again, that works great when it's three people working on one thing. But when you have 30 people and 30 initiatives, it doesn't scale. And so we get completely overwhelmed by trying to maintain all of these different conflicting conversations. It's too much communication. We're constantly context shifting and our effectiveness drops and we get completely miserable. But it's not surprising that we got there, because it was just our natural instinct, and this new technology allowed us to scale it up to levels that our brain never would have assumed was possible back when these networks were being evolved.
Back to deep work before we leave it, because that could be a whole episode in and of itself. But I think you make the argument in deep work that the average person has a capacity of about 4 hours a day max for like really concentrated effort. So if you're writing that talk, creating a business plan, writing a sermon, outlining a series, reorganizing the company, that cognitively demanding work. It's about 4 hours a day. And I would love for you to talk about just why that is a superpower. I think you actually call it a superpower, and that is so scarce in the world today. What's the benefit for leaders who are tempted to say, Cal, you don't understand my world. I got, 1,000 people I'm trying to serve. I got all these clients. I got this big congregation. They're always wanting me. I got a big staff. Like what, because I've seen the benefit in my own life, but I want to hear it in your words. What would you say the benefit or the superpower of deep work is?
Well, there's two big things you get from unbroken concentration. One, you can learn things faster. So if you need to learn something that's new or complicated, doing it with unbroken concentration is immensely more productive than trying to learn something with more distracted concentration. There's a lot of reasons why that's true, but we know that in many contexts today, the ability to learn new things, new systems, new ideas, new philosophies is crucial for success. Two, you produce higher quality with less total time invested when you're very concentrated versus scattered. So if you have to, produce a book chapter or write a sermon, you can take half as much time to do it if the time you spend on it is actually very concentrated. So, this is one of these paradoxes, is that you assume, well, if I'm also checking email while I'm working on this hard thing, I'm more productive because I'm making progress on these issues in my inbox at the same time that I'm working on this. But what you don't factor in is it's going to take you twice as long, 3 times as long to get that same thing done. And even then, the quality might be less than if you gave it unbroken concentration. So those two factors mean you got to be pretty careful about preserving unbroken concentration in your workday because it can make a big difference.
So this could be a total rabbit trail, and if it is, we'll leave it. But it's got me thinking, like you make the argument that deep work is so scarce, therefore it's so valuable. The people who can really bring value to an organization, create a coherent thought these days. Do you think there is a correlation between the rise of shallow work and what we might call the rise of shallow thinking? I've also followed Tristan Harris's work and so on, when it comes to social media and the polarized, trivialized debate that we have in public. Do you think shallow thinking and shallow work go together?
It's an interesting question because there's sort of two related forces there, but it's unclear how related, right? And I've dealt with both. So like in my 2016 book, Deep Work, and in my new book, A World Without Email, I'm looking at the world of work and the impact of technology. But in between those two books, 2019, as you mentioned, I published Digital Minimalism, which looks at technologies in our personal life. So things like social media, things like our phone. And they're similar in the sense that they both really fragment our attention and bring us away from things that are more valuable. But they're different in the sense that the motive forces behind them are quite varied. So if you look at what's happening in the public sphere with our conversation with polarization, it's be driven by things like social media. You have these companies that are actually intentionally trying to get you to use these things as much as possible, to spend as much time as possible on these platforms, to make them as engaging as possible in a completely value agnostic, algorithmic driven way. Whereas in the world of work, the force that's driving us to more distraction, the force that's driving us to more fragmented attention is tools like email and Slack, which there's not someone behind these tools who's saying we want people to use email more, or we're going to make money if we use email more. So actually the dynamics that got us into this world of constant communication, email use in work are much more interesting and emergent. I basically argue that it was accidental that we ended up in this place where we email all the time. Whereas in the world of our personal interaction with technology, like what we see today is actually the somewhat inevitable result of a intentional business plan.
Right.
How do we get people looking at this thing as much as possible so we can get as much data and sell them as much ads? And it was, Skynet invented the Terminator and things got out of control. So anyways, I'm glad you bring it up because these two magisteria, the world of work and the world of technology outside of work, in some ways seem very similar. Yeah. But in some ways, when you look underneath the covers, there's really different, in interesting ways, different sort of forces going on.
Well, and they converge for a lot of leaders on their phones. So, I've been at this a long time, 25 years in leadership. And like to go back to the 90s, which you're younger than I am, but to go back to the 90s, here was the big debate in pastoral ministry. Home phone versus work phone. Like it was landlines, it was pre-cell phone. You had to be mega wealthy to have a cell phone in the 90s. And it was like, oh, please call me on my work phone, right? And of course, all those categories are out the window. And the challenge with most leaders, it's true in sales, it's true in ministry, it's like on this phone, and I write about it in my next book, like I've got at least 11 inboxes and it follows me all the time. And so I want you to speak to the leader who's trying to set up boundaries. And they're like, my congregants, they're trying to reach me 24/7. I look at Facebook, there's 5 new messages. Then I go to Instagram, there's messages there. And they're like, hey, can you come and, deal with this? And then I open my inbox. Like we have this fused world right now. And salespeople have the same thing, right? And there are some corporate cultures where it's like my boss emails 24/7 and all weekend long. Any good guidance, and I know that could be a deep dive of its own for leaders who are living in that world where they're like, Cal, I can't catch a break from like morning till night. People are trying to reach me and get my attention and get me to act, and it's causing me to burn out.
Well, this is the big problem of the time. I mean, to put some chronology to my thinking on this, so it's 2016 is when my book Deep Work came out, and that book was about, hey, concentration is more important than we realize. We've kind of accidentally built these work cultures where we're distracted all the time. I don't think we realize how negative that is. There's a big competitive advantage if you're one of the few to prioritize focus. Right. But part of the feedback to that book was, Cal, this culture of constant communication, I always have to be communicating, I always have to be servicing messages, I always have to be servicing Slack, etc. It's incredibly deeply entrenched and seemingly impossible to escape. And that's what led to the new book, A World Without Email, where I asked the question of why? Like, if it's so damaging, why do we work this way, and what can we do about it? And my big point in the new book, which gets to your question, is that you have to look beneath like habits and tips and etiquette and norms, because what really matters is what is the underlying workflow that your organization uses to actually organize work, to identify tasks, to assign tasks, to review tasks. And if you don't have an answer to that question, then you probably have just implicitly adopted a workflow based on ad hoc unstructured messaging.
Totally.
Now, I call that the hyperactive hive mind. I want to give it a name, just like I gave Deep Work a name in that book, Deep Work. And in the new book, I call the new workflow the hyperactive hive mind. And the big observation is if the hyperactive hive mind is the primary way by which your organization actually coordinates, you cannot escape tons of messaging. You cannot escape the need. If you try to back away from messaging, it's a problem. No one individual can leave this. If you try to just throw etiquette at it, if you try to say, look, let's do email-free Fridays, let's try to do no expectation of responses after 5, these are going to fail because constant communication is the fundamental way that your organization actually grows. So my big argument is to solve this problem, you have to go deeper and say, let's replace the hyperactive hive mind with a different approach to doing our work that doesn't generate so many messages. Like you gotta kill the root to get rid of the weed. And I think a lot of what we've been doing with a lot of inbox hacks and let's have better subject lines and let's have better etiquette is we're just kind of cutting at the leaves of this invasive weed and saying, why does this thing not go away? We got to actually get down and poison the roots. And to me, that is the fundamental question of how does information come into our organization? How do we organize it? How do we assign tasks? How do we review tasks? How does that all happen? And can we be doing it better?
Can you define the hyperactive hive mind? I thought that was a really fascinating metaphor.
Well, so that's my name for the workflow that says the primary way that work unfolds in your organization is through ad hoc, unscheduled, unstructured messaging. Mm-hmm. So like the 3 cavemen that were in the savannah hunting the antelope, you sort of just figure things out on the fly with messaging, whether it's for email or Slack or whatever tool you use. I'm somewhat agnostic, but that is the fundamental way that most organizations organize themselves right now. So when I named my book A World Without Email, what I actually meant is a world without the hyperactive hive mind workflow as the primary way of organizing things.
Mm-hmm. The whole idea, I call it whack-a-mole sometimes, where you clear out your inbox and then Slack's blowing up and then you get 5 text messages. So it's that kind of like flitting from activity to inbound that has become work for most people. And your argument is because that is the typical workday for most knowledge workers, any productive work or deep work tends to get moved into the early morning hours, evenings, or weekends.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly inefficient deployment of this, what I call attention capital. I mean, you have all this latent value in the brains and attention reserves of the individuals in your organization. And you're getting a very low return on this capital if you're doing this constant back and forth communication and people are trying to squeeze more productive value production to the morning, to the afternoon. But the key thing is when you understand it's the underlying workflow that's the problem, then you realize that the common reaction, like, people are very frustrated with this way of working, but this common reaction is hey, if I stopped using email, I wouldn't be able to get any work done. That's true, so long as the underlying workflow that dictates your work demands that email is the primary way to organize it. And so to get past that reaction of just the way I work today requires an email all the time is that we actually have to ask, well, how do we actually work? And there's where I think the huge opportunity is. Not just an opportunity. I mean, I think it's the argument I make in the book. I think it is inevitable if we look at the history of technology and commerce intersecting at various points throughout our economic history, that is inevitable that this early, like highly improvisational way that we work as digital knowledge workers today, it's inevitable that we're going to move past it. 10 years from now, we're not going to have an inbox with 1,000 messages that it's just our name at company.com and we're doing emails all day. We're going to look at that as rudimentary as Henry Ford thought that the way that Benz was making the original automobiles was rudimentary. That we are going to get more sophisticated because there's a lot of value being left on the table because we're not making very good advantage of all these attention capital resources we have. So I think it's inevitable. This is just the story that repeats again and again in the history of technology and business, that a new technology comes in, we deploy it in a sort of flexible, convenient, improvisational way for a few decades, and then we get more sophisticated. And so it is inevitable that we're not going to keep working this way. It would be very ahistorical and arrogant to think this very first thing we tried in the first 20 years of having computer networks in the office is the best way to work. Of course, it'll change. So now the question is, are you going to be out ahead of that and reap those benefits, or are you going to be trailing behind and in some sense maybe pay a punishment for that?
Yeah, I'd love to start getting into the reconstruction because you have a pretty long, nuanced argument in your book about different principles and processes, but you also quote Neil Postman a couple times. So finally, I read, I've been meaning to since college, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and last summer I read it. Great book, very philosophical and, dated in the 1980s, but still very applicable today in his principles. And you quote Postman as saying that, this isn't just addictive. Technology is not just addictive. Email is not just addictive. It's ecological. What do you mean by that? What's the distinction there?
Yeah, I mean, the point he was making is there are certain technologies that when you introduce them to a culture, it changes the culture.
Right.
And we often don't get this. We think about like, oh, we had the culture we had before plus the new technology. But he said that's often not the way it works. Like, look at the printing press. He's like, if you go back to pre-Gutenberg medieval Europe, and then you go forward to after the advent of the printing press, he says you don't have medieval Europe plus there's printing presses. You have a whole different culture. Yeah. And in some sense, that's what I'm arguing happened with email. Like in the year 2000, we did not just have, it's the 1990s office, plus people also had email. We had a completely different notion of what it meant to work. I mean, we become used to this constant back and forth ad hoc communication, but we never did anything like that before. And it was the tool itself, in some sense, just the arrival of the tool and the possibilities it opened that transformed the way we worked. And this is actually one of the kind of the big semi-controversial arguments in the book, is that I'm arguing that no one really actually decided that this is a better way to work. There is no Harvard Business Review case study that is advocating for the hyperactive hive mind. You cannot find memos from CEOs of big companies saying, here's what we're missing. We need a lot more. We need to be sending a lot more messages. We need to be communicating a lot more. No one ever decided that was a good idea. It was a side effect of bringing email into the offices. And I even tell stories in the book. I go back and I document the rise of email. People brought this into the office strictly to replace existing technologies. It was like a better version of the voicemail for internal communication and a better version of the fax machine. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the big things that enabled the rise of email, it's like a little known fact, is at the end of the 1980s, a giant consortium of aerospace contractors, so these like really huge, Northrop Grumman style aerospace contractors, lobbied to force the big telecommunication companies to put in place this standard. It's very technical. I think it was called X.400, but that made it possible for email messages from one company's network to go to another company's network because they wanted to send files back and forth without having to use fax machines or couriers. And that kind of unlocked the whole thing because now lots of companies said, oh, great, fax machines are an annoying technology. This is much better. So email came into the office for prosaic reasons. It's a more efficient fax machine. It's a more efficient voicemail. And in some of these case studies, a week later, the amount of communication in the office is off the charts. So it's just the ecological impact of the tool being in the office, and we just completely changed how we worked. No one planned for it, and then we all kind of look back and are trying to say, "Oh, okay, I guess this is what work means now. Let's have some etiquette about subject lines or how often we batch email checking." We were completely unaware of the ecological change that this invasive digital species unexpectedly created.
Well, it's interesting, you're right, because the design rules, email is just something that kind of happened. It's not like someone said, let's get everybody distracted, stressed out, anxious, and on 24/7. Nobody sat down. But Seth Godin's been a guest on this podcast. I know you're familiar with his work. He made the argument that when he was at Yahoo, and he resurrected this on his podcast recently, he made an argument he lost that was that email should not be free. That it's almost like a postage stamp, that you should charge someone. I have to pay to read your email, and then you become much more selective about what emails you read. And he said, hey, that didn't work. It's probably not going to work in the future, but it's an interesting model. But you make the argument too that because all of this technology is free, it gets hyper used and you get that instant access. Any thoughts on that on the design stage? Because I find that fascinating, because here we are reaping the benefit of all that, or the curse of all that. And I'm just curious about what you think the impact of free technology is in the midst of this.
Yeah, weird things happen when you reduce friction down to just about zero. I mean, engineers know this. If you don't have any friction, things spiral out of control. The same thing seems to happen with email. So one of the stories I liked from the book is there was this study that these researchers from UC Irvine did where they went to a company, it was like an East Coast research firm. And they said, we're going to take a group of people, a group of employees of your company, and we're going to take them off email for a week. And we're not going to prep for it. We just want to see what happens. Like it was an interesting experiment because usually these business ethnographies have been observing how people use email.
Right.
They said, let's see what happens. What goes wrong if you take it away? It's like a classic experiment. Knock out this gene, see what happens to the fruit fly, right? So I was talking to the researcher about this experiment, and she told me a story that wasn't in the paper. There was a scientist who was one of these subjects in the study, and he had been very annoyed because part of his work is he had to set up this laboratory every week for experiments they did at this company, and his boss would email him and interrupt him. I need this. What about this? What about this? Like all of these sort of like questions and tasks, and it was really annoying because it's hard to set up the lab, and it really distracted him, and it made it take a lot longer. So when this guy was off email, the scientist was off email for 1 week because he was part of this study, he told the lead researcher, oh, my boss stopped bothering me. So when I was setting up the lab, my boss wasn't bothering me. But what made the story interesting is that the boss's office was 2 doors down. So literally the boss could just walk 9 feet down a hallway and be like, hey, Bob, like, can you do whatever? So it was slightly more friction without email. It was still not a lot of friction. Right down the hallway, he was right there. You could go bother him. But just that slight bit of friction when you took away email, all of those requests went away.
Wow.
And I think that is a great example of when you bring the friction down to nothing, I can basically just shoot off a message, whatever, get this thing off my mind. There's no social capital cost. I don't have to see your face. I don't have to interrupt you. I could just do it. The system runs out of control, just like with physical systems. So I think Seth is absolutely right with that analysis, is that when you went from making communication easier, like, hey, a telephone is much easier than having to write you a letter. When you went from easier to free, I think things spiraled out of control.
You spend a good chunk of time in the book talking about the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the invention of the assembly line, Henry Ford, sort of that whole idea. And then you link that to Trello as kind of a modern knowledge workers equivalent. And I'd love for you to unpack that for people, because there's some principles there moving to the solution side that I thought were really helpful.
Yeah. Well, so I go back to the assembly line a lot. And to be clear, it's not that I think there's anything specific about the industrial assembly line that we should do elsewhere. I mean, the assembly line is very specific to industrial manufacturing. It was actually quite detrimental to the workers. What I care about is the overall process engineering mindset. So what's important about the assembly line is that Henry Ford's big idea was the most convenient and flexible way to do something is not necessarily the most effective way to do it. And so you could think about the processes and actually say, let's experiment and re-engineer these processes to try to find ways that we get a better return on our capital. That's a huge leap in thinking, but it's what I think we need in the knowledge sector. So if you go back again to Henry Ford, they were building cars before the assembly line using what was called the craft method. And just like the hyperactive hive mind today in knowledge work, it was very convenient and obvious and flexible. They would just put the chassis up on sawhorses. You would have a team working on a car. If you wanted to scale up your factory, you would have more teams and more cars. So it's the exact same way that Benz created the first automobile, just scaled up in the most natural possible way. Well, okay, if one team can build one car, we'll have 15 teams building 15 cars. It was very natural, very flexible. Ford said, okay, I get that, but maybe there's more effective ways to build cars. And so he began this long series of experiments that ended up with the continuous motion assembly line. The whole point, though, is that all of these experiments and where he ended up with was much less convenient, much less flexible, much less obvious. It created a lot of exceptions. If you didn't get it just right, the whole assembly line could stop. You had to hire more managers. You had to invest more money. I'm sure everyone hated it at the time. Like, why are we doing this? This is like, why are we have to spin? We're building these chains and these conveyor belts. It's so hard. Why would we do this? But it was 10 to 100x more productive at producing cars. And so I think the hyperactive hive mind is the craft method. Yeah, it's the obvious way to do it. Like, it's one tool. We all know it. It's very simple. Let's all gather around our proverbial sawhorses and work on the cars. It's natural. Let's just rock and roll. But what's natural, what's obvious, what's flexible is not always the best way to do it. So when you see more sophisticated approaches of organizing knowledge work, like using something like Trello, where for each project we have a board that we all share, we can see all the tasks, we can see their statuses, communication happens on the board, not through emails, you're in one context at a time, you begin to get intimations of Henry Ford's assembly line. Hey, more overhead? Yes. Could bad things happen? Yes. Could something be missed? Yes. Could the whole assembly line come to a halt because you didn't quite calibrate it yet right? Yes. But we're producing Model Ts 100x faster than we were before. And so to me, that's an incredibly important lesson to remember when looking at the way we work today in the knowledge space.
So I want to give you a real life example, which would be my little company. So I was a pastor for 20 years, a lead pastor, in the last 5 years, done this communications company pretty much full time. And I lived in the space of managing by email, which was frustrating, exhausting. So a couple of years ago, my team made a plan where we said we are no longer using email for internal communication. So the only time you're allowed to use email is if it's an outside client, somebody who isn't on our staff. So if my podcast producer, for example, says, hey, what about this thing? He can jump in on email and I'll loop in a couple staff, but it's kind of like not cool for team members to email each other. We did introduce Slack, and Slack isn't quite as voluminous as email is, and basically the expectation was you have to respond the same business day, not right away, same business day. Just get back to somebody, and then we have weekly meetings where we just kind of park everything for the weekly meeting because most stuff, as you point out, Covey said, it's important, but it's not urgent. Like it can really wait until Tuesday or Thursday. And then if it's conflicted or super difficult or complicated, then we absolutely default to video and we do this. We just have a face-to-face communication. So because sometimes, you're 10 Slack messages later, you still haven't figured out. We also realized, getting ready for this show, this podcast, this episode, and reading your book, that we also use Asana for task management. It probably functions way more like Trello than we realize. And we could be creating boards and spreadsheets that are even more efficient than Slack. So I'd love for you just kind of pick that little, we call it the workflow triage system. It's definitely reduced friction in our company. It means we can work on it, not in it all the time. But I'm sure we can get better. So any thoughts on that, or what's good, what could be improved?
Well, first of all, I love that general principle that email is good as a means of delivering information. Email is good as a means of delivering files, but it is not great as the primary tool for which internal coordination happens.
Yeah.
So just as a general heuristic for thinking about rebuilding your company, I think you're on the right track there. You do not want internal coordination to occur as just back and forth messages that all fall into the same sort of undifferentiated inbox. So I think that is great. The way I would just put some structure around the way you're thinking is that you take your company and say, if we're reflective about it, there's certain processes we do. There's a process for like podcast episode production. There's a process for marketing. There's a process for whatever, consulting engagements or whatever it is. Like whether you call that or not, there's these different processes that produce things that are useful to the company. Once you name them, you can then ask for each, how does the information flow work for this process and how do we want it to work? Is there a more effective way to build this process? And by effective, I think typically in knowledge work, what you want to try to minimize is the number of context shifts required to actually produce valuable output out of this process.
Slack to Asana would be a context shift.
Yeah. Or if it was the way that like this podcast episode gets produced is there's a dozen back and forth emails. That's a dozen context shifts that you're inducing. There's a dozen times someone's going to have to stop what they're doing and look at that email. So then you might prioritize alternative processes that maybe you have, the same overall time spent or even more time spent in like a weekly meeting, but it prevents back and forth emails in between. That would be more effective. And so like one of the case studies in the book, for example, I talked about a media company that produces, they have like videos that go out every single day. And I talked about how they had a whole system put together that required essentially no back and forth communication. They had the spreadsheet that had the current status of each video, and the various people involved would just check it on the spreadsheet. And when the status had changed to something that was relevant for them, there was pretty clear expectations. Like, okay, now it's in my court to whatever. Do the edits, move the video over here, then I'll change the status on the spreadsheet that, okay, now it's ready for being pushed out to the platforms, and the people who do that take it. And so like they had taken a media production process and got rid of all the back and forth communication. It was all driven by, they had a process that was like really clear steps and a really clear indicator of what step it was currently in. So, once you have things processes, once you try to optimize processes for minimizing back and forth communication, it leads to a lot of innovations that allows everything to get done without you individually having to feel like there's this constant unstructured deluge of messages that you're trying to keep up with.
No, I found that I took that directly to my team. When I read that in the book, you were kind enough to give me an advanced copy of A World Without Email. And when I read that, because it was so simple, I think it was like a Google spreadsheet or something like that, or an Excel spreadsheet. And it was funny because I remember we did that process with a West Coast firm that does our marketing when we were doing a sales funnel. And it was literally a spreadsheet. And then it said, edited or ready for publication or ready for filming. And you would just change the status inside the document. So it's not even an expensive software solution, but what it meant is it wasn't 17 emails back and forth. Like, have you edited that yet? Okay, when will you be done? Thursday morning, Thursday afternoon, like that 17 chain reply all email that drives everybody crazy.
Well, yeah, it's an easy change, but it's one that you wouldn't make unless you realize the game here is trying to minimize back and forth.
Right.
If what you're trying to do is just keep things convenient and flexible, you would say, well, why bother with that? Like, I could just email you, So the hyperactive hive mind is always easier, and it's always more flexible. I interviewed this researcher in the book who was in the 80s and the 90s, was at the forefront of how do we use new computer technology and computer networks to try to make things more productive. And everyone was trying to build these very complex IT systems, for all, if you have a podcast production, then we're going to have like this custom built network application. She said all that research ended when email came along because everyone realized like, well, we could just get everything done with this one tool. You learn how to email people, you learn how to attach things to it, you learn how to do CCs, and you can basically do any process. So it's always more convenient, it's always more flexible. So the key thing in your discussion there is shifting the goalpost from what's going to be easiest to what is actually going to make us most effective. And by effective, we mean make the most use of this resource that we call attention capital. And those are two different things.
You mentioned Trello. I used, I think, a beta version of Trello a few years ago, and we moved to Asana. Any thoughts? Like, are you talking, a lot of people use Basecamp, et cetera. So are you saying like a project management system like that can reduce a lot of friction? And can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think all of these are good options. I mean, like Asana tends to be more popular in like software development type worlds because it has a lot of hooks into the specifics of agile project management philosophies. Trello has a lower learning curve. Basecamp has more features. But all of these can be much better than the hyperactive hive mind because what you start to do is A, you structure what needs to be done. B, you make it transparent so the whole team can see it. C, you take information out of this big pile that's your inbox and you move it into the context where it's relevant. So like, here is the site for this project. All of the information for this project is on this site. That alone is so much better than all the information needed for this project is spread out among messages over 20 inboxes. Like it's buried, by the way, with information about 20 other projects, So all of that makes it much better. When you move information into these type of project management type tools also, it's much easier to synchronize and coordinate because now we can all just get together and look at the Trello board or the Asana board or the Basecamp site, and we could just have a quick check-in. Like, okay, I can see who's working on what do we need to change, who needs what, let's go. And that is so much more efficient than having all those decisions made over 20 different back and forth ad hoc email conversations throughout the day. So it seems like sometimes I have stock in Trello because I push that particular example a lot. But I really think, as you said, like a shared Google document could go a really far way. I mean, before the pandemic, just what you can do with a whiteboard that everyone sees could go a really long way. So yeah, it's not about having just the right tool. It's about optimizing the right thing.
Yeah. So is that what's underneath the process principle or the protocol principle? Do you want to unpack some of those ideas in a world without email?
Yeah. So there's these three principles that have to do with how you get rid of the hive mind. So the process principle is really hitting that overall point that you need to identify and optimize processes. Right. This is what Ford did when he built the assembly line. You have to have that mindset. We have processes. We have to name them. We have to optimize them. You have to get into that mindset. Knowledge work has not done a lot of that, but it needs to. The protocol principle is a principle that can help you do that. And that talks in particular about if there's certain types of communication that happens commonly, putting in the effort up front to build an optimized protocol, even if it's more of a pain in the beginning, can minimize the sort of overall impact on people's brains. So it's often worth kind of building, like we talked about with the spreadsheet, and you change the status. And then when I see that, I know it's my turn to pick it up. That's more of a pain up front than just saying, email me when you're ready. But when you put that effort in up front, you get back dividends over time because it's every day less context shifting. And so every day you're getting a little bit more out of that attention capital. And then the final principle I had for optimizing processes is talking about specialization. And in general, I think that we get a better return on attention capital when people do less things, but they do the things they do better. There's been a shift over the last 20 years towards making people more generalist. People do more things, and they do all of them worse. And I do not think that's the right equilibrium if you want to get the biggest return. So I'm kind of calling for one of the things I see is a return, for example, of more support, more separation of frontline value production from back-end logistical support, people with less on their plate, but more accountability that the things they do really well. I'm just convinced that is a configuration in which you get the most value out of your resources and people are the happiest.
It's funny. I had a corporate coach last year who coached me and another mentor who really spoke to me, and they've scaled companies, and both would say specialization is a key to scale. Because when you're small operation, small church, small company, small business, you want a generalist. Oh, you can do this and you can do that. But they said, if you really want to make that pivot, particularly in a high growth environment, you have to specialize. And the older I get, the more I realize, actually, I'm only really good at a couple things. I can interview people, I can write, and I can talk. And that's about it. I'm a communicator. So you would see the same thing, like specialization?
Yeah. Well, and it's sometimes it's counterintuitive at first because specialization seems like it's more expensive.
Right.
Because you need more people.
Right.
But it could, in the end, be way more profitable. One of my favorite studies from the book was to study back from the late 1980s, where this economist from Georgia Tech was studying these Fortune 500 companies that were firing their support staff. Because what happened as the 80s went into the 90s, we got personal computers and things like word processors, and you didn't have to have support staff. Like a lot of the logistical tasks in corporate America became just easy enough with personal computers that it's possible for an executive to do them. Whereas before it's like, I don't know how to type. I don't have a type or whatever, right? So a lot of companies said, great, we could fire the assistants. We could fire the typing pool. We could fire the support staff and we'll save a lot of money because that's salary we don't have to pay. And so Sassone crunched the numbers. I basically said, yeah, that's true. But all of that work shifted onto the plate of the executives. So now the executives cannot do as much of the frontline value production as they could before. So what do you need? You need more executives. They get the same amount of work done. The problem is executives have higher salaries than the support staff. So he crunches all the numbers and said, okay, in the end, to produce the same stuff, your salary cost ended up 20% higher.
Wow.
So it felt like you were saving money by firing the support staff, but you weren't taking into account the cognitive cost of putting that work. We just treat people's brains like these infinite black boxes. Just, hey, whatever you throw at them, they'll do. And that's not, there's a psychological reality to it. So I think that effect, he called this the diminishment of intellectual specialization. I think it's a crucial factor. So specializing feels more expensive. You're like, but I could have you also do this and also do this. And I don't want to have to hire another person, or I was just doing an interview with a print reporter who talked about how he got a lot of pushback from his peers because he started hiring someone to do his transcription of his interviews. Because they're like, but you could do that and you would save the money. But he's like, yeah, but if I do that, I can't write as many articles. And like in the end, I'm not going to be as successful. I think that plays a huge role. Letting people do less, but do it better. Specializing, maybe it's more people, maybe it's more money at first, but your growth and your value production and your success as an organization will almost certainly far outweigh what you had to outlay to support that specialization.
So I want you to paint a picture, if you can, of, pick an office environment, a church environment, but just let's say it's a smaller business or a mid-sized organization. What does a day look like if you're not playing whack-a-mole with Slack or your inbox all day long? Like what might that look like in a practical term for a knowledge worker?
Imagine a day in which maybe you look at your inbox once, and if you forgot to do it, it wouldn't be a big deal. Like that's where I think a lot of people could get. I'll give a specific example. There's a small, like a dozen person tech company that I profiled in the book, and they had gone through all the standard hive mind issues. They were huge email people. That Slack came along, and so then they became huge Slack people, and it became completely overwhelming to the point where it burnt out two of their engineers who quit. And the co-founder says, enough is enough. I'm not going to work this way. I don't care if the company goes under. We're not running this on email. We're not running on Slack. We're going to have to figure out how else to do it. And they shifted to a model where they had project management software. They had a morning check-in and an afternoon check-in. All the information, who's working on what, all the knowledge. So
is that like a video and in-person check-in, or was it like inside the project management tool?
It was a mix. So it was inside the project management tool. Some people would be in the office, and the people who weren't would join via video.
Right.
So So if they had all been in the office, it would have been in the same room. But
so it's like a stand-up meeting, a 15-minute stand-up meeting or so.
They would do stand-ups like you see in software, and they do one in the morning, right? Okay, who's working on what? Who needs what? What happened to the thing you're going to do yesterday? Good work. And then people just worked on those things until the afternoon, and then they checked in again. And all along, they were updating the product management system, and they were putting notes in there and updating the status and moving things along. They check it again in the afternoon, and that was it. And I actually had the CEO. I had him on the phone. This was years ago when I first interviewed him. I said, open up your inbox. Like, go through it now. I'm just curious, like, what's in your email inbox right now? And he was like, oh, okay, I haven't seen it yet today. He was going through it, and he was using it like you would have used a mailbox 20 years ago. It's like, yeah, okay, here our accountant is sending us, an invoice, and here is a bid from a contractor. It was like nothing urgent, no work. It was the stuff you would get in your mailbox without the inconvenience of going to your mailbox. And I just thought it was fantastic that they mainly just worked, and they coordinated in a very condensed way. They had very structured environments to keep track of information. And the email inbox was like, oh, here's an announcement about we're going to have a, Boxer Day as a vacation day this year. Like the type of stuff you want to use it for. And so, all right, so that's another example. Like I talked about a marketing firm in there where they had a Trello board for every project. And the workflow there was you were like, I got to work on this project now. You go to that Trello board. All the information is there. You see what needs to be done. You make progress. You update the board. Like, I'm done working on this project now. Great. Now let me go to a board for another project. And like that's where all the interaction happened. So that's what we're talking about. A world in which you're not talking about your work all the time, and your email inbox really seems like it used to be in the old days when you go to your mailbox at your office, and be like, oh, let's see what letters I got today.
Yeah, this is so timely for us. I mean, coincidentally, one of our goals, our wildly important goals for DX framework, was to improve our systems. We've had double, triple digit growth the last 5 years in a row. Some of the people are new, and it is duct tape and Band-Aids for our systems in that context. And so much of what you are describing is exactly what we're trying to tackle. Are you actually proposing a world without email where there is no Carey at CareyNieuwhof.com or Cal at CalNewport.com? Or because we connected for this interview over email. I emailed you off your website, that kind of thing. Like, are you saying it's a world without email, or it's just like where it's like the post office box from the mailbox from 20 years ago?
Yeah, exactly. The actual title would be A World Without the Hyperactive Hive Mind Workflow. that doesn't quite roll off.
Publisher didn't go for that?
I think,
no.
Yeah, I think email is a perfectly fine protocol for, again, delivering information and delivering files. It's great. Yeah. I'm a computer scientist. I think it's a great protocol. The thing I dislike is the idea that we can organize and coordinate and do all of our business, all of our collaboration with ad hoc, unsupervised back and forth messaging. So yeah, right away in the introduction of the book, I say, okay, here's what the hyperactive hive mind workflow. This whole book is about evaluating this workflow. That's part one. Spoiler alert, it does not come off looking very good. And then part two is what are the principles for moving beyond it? So I love email as a tool. I just don't think it should be the foundation of how all collaboration occurs.
And you make the argument it probably will lead to a shorter work week as well for a lot of people. Is that correct? Did I read that right?
Yeah, there's a ton of overhead because of all this context switching. It's an incredibly inefficient way to actually use our cognitive resources, to the point where I actually think this is a problem that knowledge workers, especially creative knowledge workers, are not worried enough about when it comes to AI. We are so inefficient at working because of the hyperactive hive mind workflow is that one of the things we should be worried about is that when AI comes in and reduces that burden. So one of the huge under the radar investments in workplace AI right now is basically to take the hyperactive hive mind coordination off your plate. So you could have, like, the dream is you will have your equivalent of a chief of staff, like Leo McGarry in the West Wing, but it's an AI agent. And it talks to everyone else's AI agent. It just tells you, like, hey, here's what you should work on. Here's the materials, go, right? AI is going in that direction to allow human brains to do the things that human brains do best, which seems great, except for we're so inefficient right now that if that happens too fast, it is going to drastically reduce the number of paid employees required to get the same amount of work done. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen when you come into a law firm and say, oh, when you're not billing emails at every 6 minutes, we can service the same number of clients with, half of the first-year associates. Well, if you're the partners, like, great, we're going to hire half as many first-year associates because that's way more profits for us. Or our ad agency needs half of the creative executives because they get twice as much done. It could actually be a problem. So it's not that AI can automate creative work, but we're so inefficient right now that if it makes it more efficient, there's going to be this gap period where we're going to lose the need for all of this cognitive capacity. I think eventually the economy will reconfigure and find uses for all this highly skilled creative capacity, but that could be a really rocky transition. So in other words, I think we're so inefficient right now that we should be worried we should worry what will happen if we rip off these inefficiencies. There might be long bread lines of, lawyers and ad executives and professors once we get so efficient.
This is a little hobby of mine, just barely studying AI, but I'm fascinated by the dialogue. Do you have an approximate time frame of when you think technology like that? And I know it's $1 million question. If you knew, you'd know. But like, is this 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road? Any thought on that?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. AI, it's interesting because it's non-continuous. It tends to have these discontinuous jumps, right? And we've seen a few of those happen recently. So we've seen the discontinuous jump in semantic understanding of spoken speech. So a lot of this was driven by things like Siri and Alexa, were putting these devices in tens of millions of people's homes so they could have all of this data and practice, try to understand what people are saying, interpret speech and interpret the intention behind speech. I took a course on this when I was a grad student at MIT not that long ago, and the world is completely different today. I mean, what happens today is magic, right? So we have these discontinuous jumps, so it's a little bit hard to predict, but there is a ton of money like the reason why there's so much money in, for example, Alexa or Google Home is not just that, oh, this is a big market, everyone will have one of these in their home. It's because if we could get to the point where we really understand when you talk to me, not just the words you're saying, but what you want. Oh, you want me to turn up the volume, you want me to do whatever. That's really the killer app for workplace chief of staff style assisted AI. Like, oh, I understand what Carey wants. I know now I could talk to another AI. We could very efficiently figure it out. There's a ton of money in it. Like there's a lot of money in the Watson project at IBM right now that not everyone really knows about, that is going into monitoring workplace communication and trying to figure out like what's going on here and how can I help. I profile a company called X.AI in the book that all the thing they were trying to do was just schedule meetings. You talk to this AI bot and it'll schedule a meeting with you. And they put like $6 or $7 million into this over like a period of a year just to try to get. So there's a lot of money going into these things. And by the way, it was the CEO of that company who told me like, no, the goal is not to get that really good at understanding you and scheduling your meeting. The goal is to get my X.AI bot to talk to your AI X.bot bot, and then neither of us have to think about the meetings at all. They figure out that we need a meeting and they schedule it on our behalf, right? So I think 5 to 10 year window. Wow. 5 to 10 year window, based on the jumps we've had recently, we're going to start to see potentially a fundamental change in the office.
Well, and you are a computer scientist. That's your training. That's what you teach. Do you have a dystopian or a utopian version of AI in the future? It is a fascinating, widely debated subject.
Yeah, I go back and forth. So I'm not sure. So I'm not confident in my answer. Like I think, for example, in the workplace, that the intersection of the workplace and technology is something that I'm somewhat known for. It depends on the speed. So, I think if we have these highly efficient chief of staffs faster than we know what to do with, there will be a period of disruption. I'm also optimistic, though, where I think that the economy will find ways to redeploy this cognitive capital, and long term that could be more positive. Like there's a lot of areas of life in which the scarcity of our own cognitive capital, a scarcity of our own time and attention, is a real impediment. So if you could free up a lot of like highly creative, highly trained cognitive capital that can be redeployed. I mean, even just thinking about students in an underserved school to be able to have more cognitive capital that could come in and be like, we could work with you with like tutoring and one-on-one attention, or we could, there's a lot of potentially socially beneficial redeployments of this capital. I just don't know how bumpy that's going to be. But the one thing I'm sure of is we're using way too many people now to produce stuff in the knowledge economy that we're going to need whatever the period is, 10 years from now, 50 years, 20 years from now, just because of the huge inefficiencies of the hive mind. We saw the same thing, of course, in industrial technological advancement. It took a lot of people to build stuff. We build stuff with a lot less people now because of technology. Those people now we've had to redeploy, and a lot of that got redeployed into our current knowledge economy actually over time. It was very disruptive when it happened. We're going to have the same thing happen with knowledge work. I mean, we don't need as many people as we have right now to match our current level of production, but we're just so inefficient. That's where we are.
Well, and often staff expansion, hiring can be, I remember I was on a consulting thing a couple of years ago and they're like, we need more staff. As an outsider looking in, I'm like, no, you've got plenty. Cal, if you have staff, if you have a couple more minutes, just a couple of quicker questions for you. Yeah. I run a 100% digital company. So and I think the post-pandemic world is going to be hybrid companies, digital companies, virtual organizations, as well as some people with, totally in-person staff. But, there's a massive acceleration going on in that field right now as we speak. Are there any particular rules that you would have in mind for virtual or hybrid companies where you don't have everybody in the office?
Well, so I went deep on this topic. After I'd finished writing this book, I did this big piece for the New Yorker earlier in the COVID pandemic to look at remote work, the history of remote work, what's going to happen as we shift more companies to more remote work. And one of the big conclusions I came away is that when you move completely remote, some of the issues of the hyperactive hive mind get amplified. So the urgency and the benefits of having more structured work both become more important the more remote that you actually shift.
Oh, wow.
This is why, for example, the one industry in the knowledge sector in general that really doesn't have much trouble being completely remote. In fact, even before the pandemic, there was giant companies that had huge remote teams with software development. And why is software development easily able to make that jump to remote is they have very structured workflows. They use these agile project management methodologies. Their work is already very structured. So if you shift remote, it could handle that very well. The companies that are having the most trouble are those that were way ad hoc, just like let's rock and roll, let's fly, I'll grab you in the office, let's send emails, and we kind of just like make things work. That just flies off the rails when everything becomes completely remote and everything gets abstracted to just these toneless emails that get sent back and forth. And so that's been my big message, is that the way to adjust to the remote economy is to get more processes in place. You got to structure your work. You got to get your systems in place. Remote work can be very, very effective if you have these structures and processes that you're evolving as a team over time, trying to optimize things like context shifts, having transparency and task assignment, trying to specialize, all of these things. So I think a world without email became a lot more relevant after we had this sudden acceleration of what was probably an inevitable move towards more remote work. But as we accelerate that, the type of principles I talked about in that book, I think, are more relevant than they've ever been.
We'll link to that piece for the New Yorker in the show notes too for leaders. And what I found too is that sometimes, and I just love your take on this, but running a digital company and running remote work, that sometimes that inefficiency is a bid for attention and human connection. In other words, I just want to talk to someone because I've been stuck in my office all day home alone. And what we've discovered is it's much better to jump on a Zoom call and actually just have a water cooler moment, or build in some extra time into our weekly, or maybe that daily stand-up that you talk about, which I'm toying with. Like, in other words, make the connection about connection, but the work about work. Thoughts on that?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think it's better to be clear about what you're trying to do, as opposed to sort of informally or implicitly try to achieve goals. Another example of this that became kind of clear during the pandemic is that there was inequities in people's time availability because of the disruption of, let's say, if you had kids,
right,
and like their school was closed down or this or that. A lot of companies, instead of directly addressing this, which you would do if you had transparency and task assignment, you could see who was working on what, or if you were specializing, like this is a reality, we have to adjust for it. Instead, they're like, well, everything is so informal and ad hoc with the hyperactive hive mind. We'll just pretend like it's okay. And the people who have much less time will just use the obfuscation of the hive mind to kind of just performatively seem like they're more busy and send a lot of emails, but not really be doing as much work. And that kind of ad hoc improvisational response to this issue is not best, right? I think it's always better just to have clarity. Here's who's doing work and why. Here's what you do. Okay, we have to adjust this because of X. If we're lonely, then let's find the best possible way for us to connect. If you can't do as much work right now, instead of you pretending like you can, why don't we reduce what's on your plate or whatever it is? I think clarity is better. And when you apply these principles to have smarter workflows, smarter processes, I think you're absolutely right. You can address these problems straight on.
Yeah. I know you got a whole section in the book on this, but just to avoid answering this in the comments, a lot of people listening going, Cal, that's awesome, but you're kind of a professor. You work for yourself. You're at the top of the food chain. Carey, you've always been the senior leader. I'm not. Like, my boss, he's on 24/7. We're in a bad culture. I'm expected to be there. What would you say to those who are sort of trapped in the middle, who are like, I'm 100% on board, but I don't make the decisions?
Right, because there's different constituencies here. And I would add that actually professors are not as autonomous as you would think. We have I wrote an article that got me in trouble a little bit at my university for the Chronicle of Higher Education that was called, Is Email Making Professors Stupid? And let's just say that led to a lunch with the dean. You know what I mean? But it's a good point. There's different constituencies for this message. And I try to be clear about that in the book. You have, let's think like executives, that you control a team or a whole company and you have autonomy. You have entrepreneurs, like it's your own thing. You're a solopreneur. It's a very small company that you control. And then you have employees.
Right.
If you're an employee and you don't really have control over your workplace culture, and you're trying to slip copies of this book into your boss's backpack, but that's only going to do so much, you might not be able to deploy everything, but there's a lot you can still deploy. And what I recommend to people is, well, look at your personal processes. Like, here's all the different things I deal with in work, and let your inbox be the guide. As you're answering emails, be like, what process is this email associated with? What process is this email associated with? And you focus on the parts of that process you can control and do the same thing. Let's structure them. Let's try to optimize to reduce the amount of back and forth emails I have to send. Let's specialize where I can. Like maybe I could adjust my portfolio. I mean, I talk about this in the book. You could try to make a trade to gain more autonomy over how you work. Typically, if you're an employee, you're going to have to offer up accountability in exchange. So I get into that potential exchange. Like, I'm going to do less. I'm going to specialize, but you're going to hold me more accountable, which can be scary, right? But there's things you can do. But by identifying and optimizing your personal processes, you'd be surprised by how much impact you could have. So yes, you can't control the emails that come in, but if those emails come in, you put them into a process that's going to reduce the amount of back and forth you need to do with this person. Even if they don't know that you have this process, even if you're not telling them about it, even if you're not having sort of annoying autoresponders, even if it's just, it seems like he's suggesting some more stuff in here, you could significantly control and reduce what comes into your inbox by just having it apply those same principles the best you can. So really, it could be as simple as like someone sends you an email, is like, hey, thoughts on the client? And you're like, okay, here's the right process. I'm just going to kind of explain this in my email, not in an overtop way, but like, yeah, this is great. We should talk about it. Here's what we're going to do. By noon on Friday, I will have my thoughts in a document in this shared Dropbox we have. You can then review it. Let's have a meeting on the books for Monday morning. We'll then make our final decision about what should go into the draft. Here are 4 times that are available. You just email back which one you want to do, and we'll rock and roll. Like, you're essentially bringing them into your process without saying, let me preach to you about a world without email. We need to have processes, and you send me too much emails. And okay, like, great. That's less emails I have to send. So it's a great question. There is a lot you could do, is my answer. There's a lot you could do by just optimizing the processes that you control, even if the people around you are sort of frustratedly not on board.
This almost moves more into digital minimalism territory. And again, I highly recommend your books. But you know, you have a lot of people listening right now. Everybody's online more post-pandemic. Like, churches got catapulted a decade and businesses did. I know my favorite restaurants are all hyper online now. And so we're all a little more attached to our devices. But you quite famously, like, you have real minimalist footprints on social media, but you've also emerged as, so, and there's people listening who are trying to build online companies, right? It's like, I'm going to be an influencer online. I'm going to be whatever. But here you are. You've written numerous best-selling books. You have a national profile, have a voice that people seek out, and you've done it kind of without much of a social media digital imprint. Like, you got a website and that kind of thing. Can you talk about that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, I've never had a social media account.
Yeah, I thought that was true. So they're all fake. If you think you're following Cal, you're not.
There's fake ones.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there's weird. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. There's multiple Cal Newport Twitter accounts with my picture. I have no idea who. Because
I wondered if that was you, and I'm like, I don't think that's Cal. Like, no.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are sort of suspiciously Russian bottish.
Asking for money, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit without what you'd expect. Yeah, so I've never had a social media account. Wow. I do have a blog / email newsletter, which I've had forever and I love. You know, I have this great audience. It's not huge like if I was on Instagram or something like this, but it's people who come to calnewport.com, which is on a server in Michigan. You know, I control it and I email people, and I have a podcast. I love podcasts because they're, I feel like it's very distributed. I control it. There's not a small number of companies that are in charge of it. It's just on a, podcast. You just put it on a server and anyone can access it through any service they want to access it. Right. But I've never had a social media footprint. I mean, my strategy has been, this was the title of a book I wrote in 2012, was just trying to be so good you can't be ignored.
Right.
You know, I want to produce good stuff, and I think hard about it. I write about it, and I have a couple ways of reaching people about it that I like. You know, I mean, I like my blog and email newsletter list because I get my arms around it. Like, some of the people who comment on my blog have been doing so for a decade. You know, I know them. It's interesting. It's like my friends, you know. And in the long run, that worked, you know. And so, like, if I've been putting a lot of energy into Twitter, I could probably get a lot of followers. And maybe it would have helped, like the last book I wrote, maybe have more sales right up front or something like this. But the impact on my cognitive resources is such that instead of publishing my 7th book right now, maybe I'd just be on my 5th.
Yeah.
Or, something people don't understand about books is like, oh, if you have a really big Twitter account, then maybe you could add an extra 5,000 sales to your first week, which, could matter with the bestseller list. But it's nothing if you're trying to sell 1 million copies of your book. That's a drop in the bucket. And how do you sell 1 million copies of the book? It's producing just the right book for the right time is just the luck/craft. So yeah, I'm a big believer. The whole point of that book, Digital Minimalism, by the way, is not that like social media is bad or other technologies are good. It's just that people should be way more intentional. Why am I using this technology? Is there a really good reason? And if so, what rules should I place around it so that I could get that benefit while avoiding all of the other harm? So it's like if you need to use social media because like whatever, your ministry uses Facebook groups as a way to organize XYZ, great. But if that's why you need it, then it shouldn't be on your phone. You shouldn't be looking at your news feed. It should be on your computer. You should log on through your desktop once a week to update that group. Once you know why you're using technology, you can optimize how you use it. And the thesis of that book is once you're trying to optimize how you use technology for this purpose, not that, you get this huge shift in the benefit to cost ratio that goes decidedly in your advantage.
Well, and I don't know whether this was intentional or maybe it's just a misreading, but having read most of your books, including Be So Good You Can't Ignore It, whatever that title is, Steve Martin quote. Anyway, I noticed a shift in A World Without Email where it felt almost as philosophical as practical. That there was a real narrative that was developing. Like I put that on my list of books to reread when I get the physical copy in my hand. And I wonder if that is a cumulative benefit of years of deep work.
I think for sure. I've been thinking hard about technology and culture for many years, trying to produce the best possible writing on it. Also, I would say there was a shift right around deep work where I began to find conciliance with my academic work and my writing. So if you go up to So Good They Can't Ignore You, and the books I wrote before them, I had my academic career where I was a computer scientist, and then I also wrote books. And they were almost like two separate things. But with deep work, there began to be this conciliance, right, where I began to focus more on technology and its impact on our culture. And it made a lot of sense that as a computer scientist, that I might also be writing for a public-facing audience about the impact of these technologies on our culture. That started to make sense, especially after I got tenure, which typically opens you up for bigger thinking. So then I began thinking about this much more through an academic frame. And so I really ramped up the intensity of the thought leaders I was around, the back and forth. I began doing more what I would say like high-end writing for like the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Wired, like writing for places that were really demanding the quality of your ideas. And that melding between my academic and writing persona and just years and years of thinking is, I think you're absolutely right. I'm glad you noticed that, I feel as if I'm increasing the sophistication. I'm really trying to lay out intellectual or philosophical frameworks for understanding technology and culture, because I think it's so much turmoil that's going on right now. There's a lot of new exciting philosophy actually being forged, and I wanted to be a part of that.
It's very encouraging. What would you say from your approach that you've outlined in your book? What's just Cal as the human being? You go home. What is the benefit of having that kind of cognitive clarity and the lack of continual distraction and buzzing phones? Like, what would you say at this point? This is the thing I'm getting the most joy out of.
Right. Well, I mean, my overall philosophy I sometimes call the deep life. And I talk about it a lot on my podcast, which was unexpected, right? I mean, I had launched the podcast early in the pandemic, but the idea was I'm going to answer questions from my readers. And I thought it would be almost entirely pragmatic, right? Like, okay, like the type of stuff we were talking about. Like I want to updo my process. I want to reduce email. I want to get more deep work, et cetera. And I just found myself pretty quickly kind of pulled by my listeners and by my own interest, laying out these philosophies for how to live and articulating my underlying philosophy, because I think there was a real hunger for this as people went through resets during the pandemic about what's important, what's not, how do I want to live my life? I think a lot of people are going through that. And so I articulated my underlying philosophy as what I call the deep life, which is you identify the different areas of your life that are important to you. Like I do these alliterative buckets when I talk about my own, like craft, community, contemplation, which captures theological, philosophical, ethical concerns, constitution, like your health, your fitness. Here's the things that are important to the areas. And then for each, what you're trying to do is basically get that signal to noise ratio up. I want to put my time on things that are really important and valuable and meaningful in each of these buckets and minimize the time I spend on everything else. Like I only have so much time and attention, so I want to make sure that in each of the buckets that are important to me, it's going to big wins. And I just think that is a foundation for a resilient, meaningful, satisfied life. And there's just not a ton of room for doom scrolling on Twitter or like being up to your neck in Slack 12 hours a day. Like suddenly that type of behavior says, I don't see what bucket that shows up as like one of the most valuable ways for me applied my time. So this notion of depth, I've really extrapolated it out of just the world of work and being like, this is my philosophy for sort of all areas of life. Focus on what matters. Don't waste too much time on what doesn't.
Man, you have been so generous with your time. It feels like that's a good springboard into a whole other conversation for perhaps another time. But yeah, listening to your podcast, I'm going to go back and back listen. I got a few episodes because I discovered it researching for today, but it feels like there's almost another book there, you know, The Deep Life. And we didn't even get into making or craft, something that I'm, you know, was challenged in your previous reading. So you're not on social, but they can find you at where online, and then we'll talk about the book. And thank you, Cal.
Yeah, well, so calnewport.com is where you can learn about the books, and that's where my weekly newsletter is housed. And then the podcast is called Deep Questions. So you can get that wherever you find podcasts, and that's about it when it comes to trying to find me online.
Cal, you've been so generous, and this has been so helpful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.